off. And right now, I'm sure your office is particularly busy. But before we go into what you've been doing, I'm in Houston now, and
Oh, cool.
I was without power like millions of other folks for 36 hours. How has this disaster touched you and those close to you personally?
So we're obviously doing fine now, but we were in the same situation as so many others across Harris County. Our power went out at 3 a.m. Monday morning, and we started to have water pressure issues soon thereafter. Thankfully, by the grace of God, my wife's sister lives exactly one block up from us. And I don't know if it's because she's on a different grid, but she and her husband, their power did not go out for the entirety of this disaster. So we were able to be there most of the time, except for a minor trip across town. And I'm sure you can appreciate that across town in Houston means an hour-long trip to go up and see my mother, who was in my parents' home in Montgomery County. She was by herself, so I went to check on her a couple of times, and that brought all kind of issues. But other than that, we were good and very grateful to be so fortunate.
Mm. And what has your office been doing since the outages started?
The first thing we did was try to get our bearings. We have folks who work in the office who live alone, who are older and live alone, who may have had health issues. Obviously, we're still battling a pandemic right now, so having only been in this position for all of 7 weeks, the first thing that I worked to do was get a handle on all of our people and make sure that they were safe and taken care of, and whether if they needed anything, we could do it for them. The second thing we did was jump straight into gear on this price gouging effort. Scrolling through social media, many of folks in the office and then friends and family had pointed out that there were various establishments throughout the county who were charging folks at an excessive rate. So we very quickly sprang into action and set up this reporting mechanism to combat price gouging. It's interesting. Senator Cruz was criticized heavily for going over to Cancun during the pandemic, and it raised a lot of questions about what the various levels of government and even the individual positions can do in such a disaster. So I saw my office's highest and best use as fighting on the price gouging issue, and that's exactly what we did.
And what have been some of the complaints that you've seen so far as you've solicited those complaints?
The most frequent complaints that we saw were water being sold at 2 to 3 times the price that the pack is normally sold at, or a store taking a pack of water and instead stripping out the individual bottles and selling them at an excessive rate individually. Gas, of course, was a big one. Some common complaints were gas being sold at 40% higher than the price that it's normally sold at, or you had a convenience store owner who was only charging cash and then would quote people a different rate that was outside or a different rate for an item that was on the shelf. And then, of course, the item that we most expected, and we did in fact see it, was the electricity prices, which it's interesting. Going into this, we knew that we would see that. We weren't yet clear, and we're still not, on what could be done from a local government perspective to combat that issue. But sure enough, a bunch of people reported, hey, if there's any gouging going out there, it's right here on this electricity bill.
Right. And I was going to ask about that in terms of what redress could even be available for that. We've seen there have been news reports about these astronomical bills. People just get out of these outages and they're hit with an enormous electricity bill. What have you seen of that, and what redress could there be for things like that?
So I think in order to fully understand that, it's helpful to kind of understand the history of the power grid and the management of electricity in the state of Texas. So the Public Utility Commission is the governmental agency that's charged with oversight of the power system, and they also oversee the private entity that manages that system, and that is a three-person board that is appointed by the governor. As most folks know, Texas deregulated 30 years ago, and so the market is now run by the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, also known as ERCOT. Prior to that, ERCOT was just a private nonprofit that assisted the then regulated utilities in harmonizing their different systems, but ERCOT's role changed when the state legislature decided to deregulate. And instead of creating an entity out of thin air to manage the grid in the retail and the wholesale market, they instead imputed that authority to ERCOT, which now manages it. So the way that Texans think of electricity is this deregulated system where there's a ton of suppliers in the market. Well, part of that is, a lot of these plans have variable rate plans. And so they're in normal circumstances, you may pay a lower rate than you typically would. But of course, in an emergency situation such as this, where supply was extremely low and demand was extremely high, those companies, including one in particular that has already indicated that they plan on taking action against ERCOT, pass those costs off to the consumer. So it puts you in this weird gray area of, it's not your standard price gouging where somebody's selling a product, some necessity, food, water, whatever it may be, at a rate that is clearly excessive and was never agreed to by the other individual. Instead, it is this power company arguing that, hey, we're entitled to sell the electricity at this rate. And in fact, ERCOT required us to when it announced that prices would be required to go up to $9,000 per megawatt hour in order to attract supply. So it's in kind of this weird position. Now, also within the confines of the law, there's a lot of law out there that says that when it comes to electricity prices, the PUC has an administrative procedure that folks can go through in order to get some type of relief on issues that affect energy companies. So that puts you in this weird predicament of our price gouging law. It's not necessarily clear whether local governments have the authority to go after these folks for excessive prices under the price gouging laws. And I think that's why we've seen the governor say that something has to be done at the state level and something will be done at the state level. My hope is that folks at the state are held accountable and actually follow through with those promises.
And on the subject of ERCOT, you have obviously been following, you've tweeted about, you've spoken about the fact that the Texas Supreme Court is looking into whether ERCOT can even be held liable, forget about price gouging, for anything. Can you talk a bit about that case and what the ripples will be if ERCOT is found to have sovereign immunity, cannot be sued for anything?
Sure. ERCOT was sued by a power generation company in 2016. And the company in that case argues that ERCOT made false statements in public reports and private investment meetings about the projected long-term scarcity of power supply in Texas, and that those statements fraudulently induced the company to spend billions of dollars on new power generation and infrastructure and investment here in Texas. ERCOT, of course, argues that because of its regulatory role in managing the electricity grid, it is immune from suit. And a court of appeals actually held in favor of ERCOT. And so that case is now before the Texas Supreme Court. So on the one hand, you have the plaintiffs in that case, which is a power generation company, arguing that ERCOT is not entitled to any immunity. And ERCOT is arguing that it is entitled to the same level of immunity that the sovereign would have. So if you sued the PUC, that same level of immunity. It's interesting because the Court of Appeals opinion in there left a bunch of questions unanswered. So one of the questions would be, what type of immunity would ERCOT be? Would ERCOT enjoy if ERCOT does in fact have immunity? In Texas, the sovereign is subject to the Texas Tort Claims Act, which allows individuals to file lawsuits against the state, but there are damages caps on there. For the state, it's $250,000 for each person, $500,000 for each single occurrence of bodily injury or death, and then $100,000 for each occurrence of injury to or destruction of property. So those, if ERCOT is indeed immune from suit and the Texas Tort Claims Act applies, then these individuals would only be able to sue up to these damage caps. But if ERCOT is found not to be immune, then obviously they'll be treated as any other private entity that's out there. And of course, the challenge here is ERCOT does obviously serve in some type of regulatory role, but it is a private entity and it doesn't receive any public funding. So it's an interesting question that the Texas Supreme Court has not yet addressed. And in fact, it was anticipated from the parties in that case that the court would answer the question here in the next few weeks. But given what we know now about Winter Storm Uri and some of the mistakes that were made in preparing for that, I think it's much more of a serious question. And I anticipate at least that the state Supreme Court will take their time in reaching a decision on that one because of the potential impact it could have on consumers who were harmed by a decision that ERCOT made with this winter storm.
And obviously part of what happens in any sort of civil lawsuit is, or any lawsuit prosecution, doesn't matter. There's a public record that's built through discovery or a trial. What will it mean for the public understanding of how ERCOT functions now that ERCOT is now not an acronym only known by Texans, it's known by the entire country? What does it mean for transparency over this organization and accountability? What are the stakes of this battle?
The stakes are huge, and I think that everyone appreciates that. Even outside of that lawsuit, the governor immediately after the disaster started to go, after first blaming renewables, she transitioned to blaming ERCOT and made it a point to say that there would be several emergency items in this upcoming legislative session that would be geared at reforming ERCOT. The Attorney General of Texas has launched an investigation into ERCOT. The Public Utility Commission, which is the governmental agency that oversees ERCOT, has announced an investigation, and I anticipate that the state legislature will announce an investigation soon enough. So I think what you're going to see is it's going to be a super in-depth process, but it needs to be a comprehensive investigation, and we need to ensure that we're holding folks accountable so they're not just paying us lip service now and not following through tomorrow. But it will be transparent, soup to nuts, or at least it should be, because right now every single resident in the state of Texas has an opinion on ERCOT, and on the decisions that were made leading up to this winter storm event. So I don't think that this entity will be able to go on in the future as sort of an inconspicuous entity that flies under the flag of night, but instead this will be a process that Harris County and residents and folks across the state are paying attention to, and people want answers, and so hopefully they get them.
And when you were running for office just late last year, the Houston Chronicle highlighted a big part of your platform. You want to expand the environmental law part of the office. What has, since your election, what have your efforts been in that, and particularly in light of the climate crisis, in having the Harris County Attorney, top civil prosecutor, tackle issues of environmental law?
I think it's another example where a little bit of background would be helpful. So Harris County is Texas's largest county, but also is the third most populous county in the country. And per the 2010 census, Harris County is more populous than 25 states. So we're responsible for a lot of folks, and obviously we take that responsibility seriously. But it also speaks to the importance of the power going out in Harris County. I mean, imagine the power in Oregon or Kentucky going out. That's exactly a similar size to Harris County, and so that's what we experience. My position is the chief civil lawyer for the county. And it's different from other counties in Texas because my office has the legal right and the legal duty to represent Harris County government in civil matters, including environmental matters. And because it's an elected position, I also owe an obligation to the greater good of the people of Harris County. But what's important here is Harris County government is changing. Our county judge, who is the chief executive of the county and the head of our county's legislative body, is a Latina who just turned 30 a few days ago. 4 of the 5 members of our county legislative body were first elected in the past few years. I'm only 32 years old and I've been in this role for all of 7 weeks, but our county leaders are bringing a new, diverse perspective to local government. But we're still limited in what we can do because we are the county, just an arm of the state, and the state reminds us of that often. Since I've gotten to office, one of the things I focused on is obtaining more resources so that our environmental division, which is the local enforcement arm for violations of environmental laws and other environmental matters, has the resources they need to fight on the issues that matter. So, for example, one of the things we do is permit objections when companies come in and try to get permits for their facilities. A good example is recently there was a facility in a low-income area of town that was seeking a permit to emit hydrogen cyanide, which is an incredibly toxic chemical. We go in and we oppose that permit and negotiate with the company to get as low of an emission rate as possible. Obviously, Harris County has dealt with a string of plant explosions and refinery explosions in the past few years. And in those instances, we're able to pursue enforcement action in the court. So we're able to file lawsuits and hold folks accountable. Here, I think our role is going to be similar to the AG's office in investigating a comprehensive investigation of the assumptions that went into determining winterization policies, the weather mistakes that were made now should have been known from the last major weather event we had to shut down most of our supply, which was in 2011. Who made those decisions, whether the market participants were involved or were negligent in any way. It really is an investigative / enforcement authority. It's a role that I take very serious, and I think kind of the closest corollary would be the Attorney General's office at the state level.
And I noticed in highlighting the younger, more diverse leadership of that's coming to Harris County, you may have even short sold your own accomplishment. You are the first Black Harris County attorney. And on that issue of what you were mentioning about that permit in a low-income area, I guess that's a good segue to the kind of topic of environmental racism. Uh, how, these disasters we've seen do not affect all areas of the country equally. How is how is your office responding to that issue, particularly when there are poor communities or communities of color that are adversely affected by environmental disasters?
Sure. So toxic facilities that emit toxic chemicals, concrete batching plants, facilities that are just harmful to the environment typically are in the areas of folks who look a certain way and have a certain income. And one of the things that I've been preaching from the mountaintop about is your zip code should not determine whether your air is pure and your water is clean. So we have really focused our environmental justice efforts in those lower income zip codes, the areas where you're going to see more refineries, more concrete batching plants. And we do it in a few different ways that I mentioned earlier with objecting to the permits, going in and pursuing enforcement actions where appropriate. But part of it is also listening. This office in the past hadn't had a very clear avenue of dialogue with the public, because who better to know what they're experiencing from an environmental justice and racism standpoint than the people who are in those communities. So we go out, we listen, and then from there, we send in investigators from the county's pollution control services department, and we take legal action where appropriate. But it's certainly something that we've seen with this latest disaster. Most of the stories you see in the media about folks who were without water and power, folks who may have had a family member who passed away, were folks who live in certain communities that are affected by environmental injustice at every single stage of the process. So it's an important issue to us, and it's something that we prioritize.
And your background in you worked for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. How is that kind of experience being brought to your role in Harris County environmental justice issues?
Sure. So I actually worked for two different international law firms, and I did a ton of pro bono work during that time period, including with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. But I think I bring a helpful perspective in that at these law firms, many of the cases we did, I have represented industry before. I know what to look for. I know the lingo. I know when we're being sold a can of goods. I know when it's time when there's a pressure point and it's time to push on it. And I know when we're just kind of chasing the wind. So I'm bringing that perspective to this, but also understanding that as a young African-American man who grew up in a working class family, I bring the perspective of having been one of the people in these neighborhoods where there was a facility that was emitting toxic chemicals. And that is the identity that I bring with me every single day into this job. And it's part of the reason why I'm so passionate about fighting for those neighborhoods, those areas, those zip codes.
And you talked about listening. What are the communities saying specifically with regard to the outages? What are some of the stories that you're hearing or your investigators are hearing on the ground?
Folks are overwhelmed, and there's a big element of trauma in it. Our local newspaper has a piece that's out right now, and the heading says there is a hidden tax to living in Houston. It's called trauma. And as I was speaking with my mother about it yesterday, it couldn't be further from, let me rephrase, it is incredibly true. It is highly accurate. When you live in Houston, everything from the severe weather events that we had a 500-year hurricane in 2015, and then a 500-year flooding event in 2016, and then of course Hurricane Harvey in 2017. These extreme weather events have become the norm in Texas, and so it's something that all communities are experiencing, but lower income minority communities tend to experience it more, and there's a level of trauma that goes with it. And so my impression is that communities feel overwhelmed right now because your power goes out, your pipes might burst, it causes damage. Now you have to go through the process of hiring a contractor. That's assuming that you have insurance that's going to take care of it. If they don't, you have to figure out a way to pay for it yourself. The problems just begin to compound. And so I think that there is definitely a sense of resilience in the city of Houston and in Harris County, that we are strong and resilient, but also at some point, folks begin to feel overwhelmed.
Mm. I've read the story that you're talking about, and it's just such a poignant, great one. The Houston Chronicle put out a good Sunday edition today, and the front page of it asks the question, and let me see if I can get it in front of me. Well, something along the lines of will I wish I had it in front of me, but
Will Texas answer the wake up call?
Exactly, that's the one. So what is your response to the question? Do you think that the leadership in Texas is up to the challenge that this wake up call has brought to their door?
The answer has to be yes. And if it's not, then we at local government and residents in Harris County have to hold folks accountable. One important point that many people miss is the government, the PUC, the governor, excuse me, the PUC and ERCOT have known for at least a decade of the problems that led to this massive power disaster. In 2011, Texas was hit with cold temperatures in February that year, and we didn't have enough supply to meet demands. There was rolling blackouts. FERC and several other regulatory bodies, including the PUC, investigated ERCOT's decisions to do the rolling blackouts, and FERC concluded that the cold weather was to blame for most of the loss of power, and ERCOT should have increased its reserve levels going into that weather event. And FERC also concluded that ERCOT's winterization procedures were either insufficient or not sufficiently followed. 10 years later, we have the same issues, and all reports are that we can expect similar causes. So our state government and our market managers failed to take basic steps that could have mitigated the impact of Winter Storm Uri. We need to fully investigate. And the term I've been using is comprehensive investigation. We need to fully investigate everything that went wrong, and it needs to be done at the state level. But local governments need to be able to have access to that information because each county, each city may have unique harm from what happened in this storm. But we have to be careful to ensure that the words that we're getting from the folks at the state level, the promises of investigations and of reform and of action aren't just words for today and forgotten tomorrow, but instead that we ensure that they follow through.
Mm-hmm. And if on the legislative level there isn't, for whatever reason, enough political will to take the actions that are necessary, what can happen from the legal community level and from the level of your offices? What opportunities does the Harris County Attorney's Office afford in addressing the problem or highlighting the problem, and what are the limitations with it? What needs political action from a legislative level?
Well, we're certainly going to join in any investigation that's taking place. Obviously, I would imagine that the market participants and the governmental agencies are going to view the Attorney General's investigative authority as greater than ours. But to the extent that we're able to participate, we will. And to the extent that we're legally permitted to do our own investigation, we'll do that as well. But one of the potential limitations there is going to be just that dynamic of these various state entities are conducting their own investigations. So getting into that, getting involved in that, there could be some challenges there. But as part of our investigation, we'll decide on how to move forward, and everything is on the table for Harris County, including lawsuits. You know, when there have been acts that have harmed people, the civil courts are one way of holding actors accountable. And so that's something that we will keep on the table. We can all be relatively confident that private actors will, residents, whether it be a class action or just some individuals, will file lawsuits on their own. There's already been a couple filed, one in the Corpus Christi area and then one here out of Harris County against ERCOT and one of the electricity retailers. So, we can anticipate that there will be heavy activity in the courts. But I think the first step is to conduct a comprehensive investigation so we can know how to proceed.
Are there any entities or companies that haven't been getting a lot of public scrutiny that you feel deserve a closer look in the wake of this?
I think that's one of the reasons why we need to do a comprehensive investigation is so that we can understand every single actor at every single stage of the process and make a determination from there as to who should be on the hook for some of the harm that was done. I mean, there are many steps of uh, in between the fuel source being taken from the earth and then being provided in the form of electricity to your home. So not just the regulators, not just ERCOT, but also all the market participants. I think the investigation needs to be comprehensive enough to ensure that we're putting eyes on every single act and we determine how to proceed from there.
Part of your platform when you were running for Harris County was holding polluters accountable. From a climate crisis perspective, what investigations might you be pursuing? What are you just generally looking into to advance that goal?
Yeah, so our our investigative authority, or at least how we've exercised it, has been in the facilities I talked about earlier. So refineries, plants that are operating in Harris County and that are emitting various pollutants. The TCEQ, the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, they handle all of the permitting in the state of Texas, and we have a local pollution control services department that is able to go in and do inspections at these facilities. So it's a few different steps. Step one is the permit insufficient? Does it allow the emission of too many pollutants, too high a level of emissions? So that's step one. Of course, step two is ensuring that these facilities are actually complying with the permits that they were issued. And then step three is if they're not, and if we cannot resolve the situation in a way that will ensure compliance in the future, then an enforcement action. So that has been kind of the core of our focus, but also obviously the pollution control department has work that it does through the county. Harris County has, under the new leadership of our county commissioners court, has invested a lot of money into building out the pollution control department so that they have the resources they need to be on the forefront of inspecting these facilities and ensuring compliance.
What sort of information about the disaster and what causes outages uh, do you feel is known by most folks in Houston or in Texas that isn't widely known on a national level?
So we don't 100% know anything yet, but I think what the experts have, for the most part, are agreeing on is that Texas had the most significant freezing weather event in the last 3 decades. And as a result of that, we had record electricity demand from so many people being at home and using electricity. But at the same time, all of our electricity sources underperformed. I think that is the general consensus as to what happened, but the bigger picture here is some of the issues with ERCOT that we've known since we deregulated, since the investigations occurred in 2011, and of course, going into this storm. And those include that Texas's grid is separate and essentially disconnected from the other two grids in the country. So that means that in most instances, we can't import supply from the other grids in the country when our demand exceeds our supply, and we can't export supply to the other grids when our supply exceeds our demand. Uh, ERCOT also does not pay generators to maintain certain reserves as a backup plan. And so ERCOT is the only grid operator in the country that does not do so. And because we're a single system state, ERCOT is not subject to federal regulations. FERC does not govern the actions of ERCOT. And then, of course, the PUC and ERCOT do not require our power plants, pipelines, wind turbines, et cetera, to be equipped to withstand the extreme cold. So the generators, or the suppliers, the market participants, they comply with the minimum standard, but that does not encompass the risk of extreme cold. And so these, I think, are going to be the three big things that part of the investigation is going to have to look at where we fell short in planning and in execution and in compliance But I think across the aisle, everybody agrees that there needs to be reform.
Mm. And in terms of, there's been widely has been widely reported all of ERCOT's board members, many of them live outside of Texas as well. How do you think fact that the fact that they are not part of the state is contributing to public outrage about their conduct during these outages?
That's the low hanging fruit. I mean, we've already seen a couple of state legislators who have indicated that they're filing bills to require the folks who serve on the ERCOT board to live in the state of Texas. You're just not, this is part of the reason why there are residency requirements when you run for offices, because generally you're viewed as connected to the community if you live in the community. You're more concerned about ensuring that the problems in that community are fixed if you are in and of the community. And so, having ERCOT members who board members who live in different states is a good example of how disconnected from reality that organization has become and why there's a need for reform.
Well, thank you very much for speaking at length about everything that's going on. Is there anything that I haven't asked you during the interview that you'd like to talk about?
No, no, thank you very much for having me on. I really appreciate it. Enjoy chatting.
Yeah, I enjoyed chatting as well. And please keep me posted on what your office is doing. We're obviously going to be following all of your investigations, the state's investigations as well. If any of this does go to the courts, we will be following those cases. So I hope we'll keep in touch for as this develops.
Good deal. Thank you very much, and you have a blessed day.